The rook went clack, and just like that, it was checkmate. "I won," said Gerald. "That's great," was all Gade could say. He seemed quite uncomfortable. And why wouldn't he be? There were no towns on the endless mountains, and hiking through them was the only way to get to the northern kingdom of Gardenfell. There were steep inclines, rugged terrain, slippery rocks, streams, and anything that would make walking more difficult here. That's what Gerald was going to the north for, to talk about building a road, carving a tunnel perhaps through the mountains to have a direct trade route to the Middle Kingdom from Gardenfell. They were in a rocky area where tall, thin pine trees grew on a relatively level path. It was a relief from all the ups and downs they had to endure. "I have to piss," said Gade. He walked to the side of the path and began to unbuckle his breeches. "Not here, you oaf! Go into the trees or something. I don't want to hear or smell it," said Gerald, shooing him away. Gade buckled his breeches back up and started rattling his head. "I don't want to smell it." He walked into the forest until Gerald couldn't hear him. Gerald waited a couple of minutes, and Gade hadn't come back. A small party of about 6 men was walking up to him, coming the same way he and Gade had come from. Gerald moved to the side of the road to let them pass. Half of them had walked by when they surrounded him and seized him. "Hey, stop! Gade! Gade!" he was shouting. They were binding him in ropes. "Your bodyguard ain't coming back. The other half of us went to take care of him. He's likely bleeding out on a stump somewhere," said a sly, skinny man. He was well dressed in a black jerkin. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smiled. "That's irrelevant. We're bandits, that's all. And what we want?" One of the bigger men shoved a cloth in Gerald's mouth and covered it, then threw a sackcloth over his head. "Well, that 100 gold is a start." "Shh!" He had gotten so riled up playing his game that he had gotten careless. 100 gold was a lot of money, and he had forgotten that he was in a tavern in a small town. The man began fidgeting with his gloves or something by the sound of it. "We were going to follow you from the minute you shouted about having 100 gold, but once we found out you were the prince..." "Imagine how much a prince is worth." "So they plan to ransom me? They'll get a belly full of arrows that way. Unless they don't plan to sell me to my father." Gerald's mind was racing, thinking of all the possibilities of what could happen. And Gade. Poor Gade. Just trying to relieve himself. He wished he had traveled with a large group. Bringing a party was a better idea. Even if Gade had been there, could the 2 of them had taken on a dozen men? It was doubtful. Gerald felt himself get picked up, and no matter how much he wriggled and writhed, the ropes wouldn't loosen. He had gotten tied up very well. It was plain that this was not their first kidnapping. They set him down in a cold corner somewhere. He sat, scared and alone in silence. "No, I mustn't give up. There is a way. I can beat them." He squirmed and slowly felt around with his head, feeling for a corner or a coat hang or something to get the sack off of his head. His head hit something wooden from the sound. He scraped his head alongside of it, trying to work the sack up, but it wouldn't come. He laid flat on the ground and tried to roll, back and forth as fast as he could. There was little space, but after a while he was able to work the sack most of the way off. It was above his nose, but still covered his eyes. He shook his head violently, shaking the bag off. Now he could see. He was in a stone shed, and the thing he had bumped his head into was a barrel. First, he would need to have something to grab with, and both of his hands were bound tightly to his body. The rope dug into his flesh as he shimmied up the wall. He worked his way up until he was at eye level with the barrel, and used the lip to remove the cloth covering his mouth. He spit out a wet, drool-soaked cloth. Next, he needed to get out of the rope. He scoured the room for something sharp. A knife, a piece of broken glass, a bottle he could break, a pointy rock, or something. There was a saw, but it was hung high on the wall. A hammer was in reach, but that wouldn't help with cutting rope. They had the common sense to take his sword and dagger from him. He saw an awl on a small stool, but awls only had a point and no edge. But it was the best thing around, so he shimmied over to it, inch by inch, the ropes scraping against his skin. He worked up the wall, using his shoulders like legs until he could get in a sitting position, or as much as the tight ropes would allow. He grabbed the dirty awl with his teeth. The handle was round, so it was very difficult to get a good bite on. He began scraping with the point at the rope around his arms, jerking his neck back and forth, picking. Little by little, a strand would pop, then another, then another. It felt like it took hours, but it was likely 15 minutes before he had cut one all the way through. Then he rolled, unraveling himself from the rope until his hands were free. He grabbed the awl and the hammer and hid behind the door. He waited, and heard nothing. He went to reach for the knob, but then he heard gravel crunching. He quickly hid once more. Then he heard a whoop, then the sound of slicing and steel clanging. Gade? But Gade was dead, killed by bandits as he took a piss. No, the people fighting outside were not likely to be heroes coming to save him, but other bandits who wanted a ransom for themselves. The clanging stopped, and Gerald heard walking outside. It was the sound of just one person, though. Then the call of an unfamiliar voice. "Hello? Shout if you can hear me!" Gerald was not about to shout. He readied the awl and hammer, and was ready to kill whoever came through that door. He heard the knob jiggle, then the door slowly opened. Gerald swung the awl downwards and aimed for the head with the hammer. But before he knew what had happened, both the awl and hammer were on the floor. Standing in front of him, grabbing his hands, was a young man, a tad shorter than Gerald, with sandy hair and forest green eyes. "Are you the prince?" the man asked. "No," he lied. "Yeah, you're the guy from the tavern. I followed those bandits that were following you. They're all dead now." Gerald hadn't even noticed, but the young man was holding a two-handed curved sword. "I'm no prince, but if it's the gold you want, they've already taken it." "No, I don't care about that. I care more about killing bandits. I figured I would free you before I went on my way." "Well, thank you very much." Gerald began wiping his clothes. "I am Gerald." "I'm Ben Blacksheep. It's nice to meet you, Prince Gerald." He gave a tiny bow. "I'm no prince, I told you." The two walked out of the shed, and there were 6 bodies strewn across the ground. "I suppose you wouldn't be looking to be hired as a bodyguard, would you?" "No," said Ben Blacksheep, plainly. "I'm meeting a friend at Warren's place. I'm supposed to be watching him compete, but it's probably over by now." Then he heard a shouting. "Gerald? Oh, you pompous prick, you better be alive! Gerald!" Out from the bushes came Gade, sword in hand. "Oh, Gerald! Why didn't you just let me piss in front of you?" Ben Blacksheep walked away without so much as a word. "Who the was that?" asked Gade. "Gade, what the hell? How could you let me be kidnapped?" 6 guys attacked me while I was taking a shit. Do you know how hard it is to fight while you're taking a shit? Gerald didn't really want to know what had happened, but apparently Gade needed to do more than piss. "Don't leave next time." "Gade, if I had the choice between being kidnapped and watching you shit, I honestly don't know which I would choose." Welcome to the Storytime Saturday podcast. I'm your host, TGD. Now, this is a much shorter chapter this week. We have a much shorter chapter, especially compared to last week's chapter. This is a 1,500-word chapter compared to last week's 6,000. In all honesty, this chapter is kind of just a filler chapter to pad out the story, to pad out the length. Like I've mentioned before, I wrote this for the NaNoWriMo challenge to get 50,000 words in a month. And you have to hit 1,600 words a day in order to keep the pace to get 50,000. And 1,500 is right around the 1,600 mark. So I probably wrote this in one day, in one session. So yeah, it's kind of just fluff to pad out the story. At the same time, it shows us, we figure out some stuff about Gerald, that we see some consequences for him being careless in his previous chapter, and we're introduced to a new pivotal character. So let's, like always, let's take a look at the writing aspect first. All of Gerald's chapters start with this catchy, "The rook went clack." I guess he only ever wins with the rook. But this time it's him describing what happened. He's describing a chess game to Gade. So now he's the one saying it and not the narrator. Very subversive and clever, isn't it? Also, very epic writing skills, where it says, "A small party of about 6 men was walking up to him." That's proper grammar. No, actually, I don't think it is. So this was one of my more favorite chapters at the time. I showed it to someone, and they said, "Wow, this is bad." So it's not my favorite chapter now. They wanted like a more of an internal monologue from Gerald, and they didn't like that Ben Blacksheep was introduced by saying the color of his hair and eyes. That was too fanfiction-y. In my new writing, I don't even know how to describe how people look. That's honestly like probably my biggest weak point. I don't know how to describe how people look. And a lot of times, I just don't. There are some characters, you'll never know what their hair color is or their eye color, even though that's like some of the most defining features about someone. Like, what am I supposed to say? They had a huge nose? Yeah, I don't know. So, yeah, it's not my favorite chapter anymore, but I figured, hey, this is action-packed, it's fast-paced, he gets kidnapped, and he's, doing stuff, so I can see now it's not that exciting of a chapter, and it's short. So, also, we'll talk about this now. They pointed out, the person I showed this to, they pointed out that this prince had no issue. He walked outside and sees 6 men slain, like absolutely destroyed, killed, and he doesn't think anything of it. He walks outside and there's 6 bodies strewn across the ground. And his response is, "I suppose you wouldn't be looking to be hired as a bodyguard." They thought that was weird. They thought, oh, well, why is he not reacting to that? And I had to reply, that's on purpose. That's on purpose. So, as we know, if you've listened to any of the other Gerald chapters, he is quite a devious and malevolent character. And he is very bluntly thinking about killing whoever comes through the door. He plans on killing whoever comes through. He really has no problem with that. He fails, of course. But in this chapter, we see that Gerald really isn't. That really is, we do see that he's not just some prissy noble, that he's not completely soft. He's able to think his way out of being tied up and kidnapped. We show that he's resourceful and clever, and he's able to get himself out of the situation. Gade, Gade is probably one of my favorite characters. I like the high contrast between this prince and this scoundrel. We see the very high contrast between Gerald and Gade, as Gade just starts pulling down his pants in the middle of the road, and that's where disaster strikes. because Gerald tells him to go away. He doesn't want to watch him urinate. This Ben Blacksheep character, he shows up in a big way, and we learn a few things about him. So first off, we know he's a good enough fighter to take out 6 men by himself. We know that he has a 2-handed curved sword. We know he has a friend competing at Warren's place, and that he hates bandits, and we know he has forest green eyes. So I hope some dots are connecting in your head. I hope some wheels are turning so you figure out who this character is. And of course, he is a pivotal character. He does have some chapters later on, much later on. So we'll go over him when we get to that. We also get a bit of a funny moment from Ben Blacksheep when Gage shows up, and Gage, he says, "I should have pissed in front of you," and Ben Blacksheep walks away without saying anything. He just disappears. So some notes, like I mentioned, Gerald's in the previous chapter, he was bragging and saying, "I'll bet 100 gold against your daughter's virginity." And everyone in the tavern heard that. 100 gold? 100 gold is a lot of money. We know that from Fari's chapter. In Fari's chapter, he won 100 gold, and he said if he spent it right, if he invested it right, that could last him a lifetime. So 100 gold is loads of money. So him bragging about that caught everyone's attention. He had been careless and caught the attention of people. He caught the attention of these bandits who decided to trail him and wait until he was far in the mountains, and they couldn't. He wouldn't be near a town to get help or anything. Something that's kind of stupid and needs to be pointed out is that the bandits have a shed in the Endless Mountains in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, okay. So that's kind of dumb. Again, you could really tell that I just came up with this in one day. I didn't really think it through too much. But this was a shorter episode of the Storytime Saturday podcast. I guess they don't all have to be super long, and they're not all going to be long. Next week, I'm assuming that it is going to be much longer because we go back to Warren's place, back to Sir Jacob, to see what's going on at the tournament. So come back next week and find out what happens in the second round of the tournament. Some interesting stuff happens. I'm sure we learn more. I think we learn more about Sir Jacob and we learn more about the king. So come back next week for the Storytime Saturday podcast. It's a lot of work to do this, to go through and read it all and take notes and stuff and have to make commentary on it. But it is enjoyable, and I hope you're enjoying it too. Maybe. I hope you're enjoying it. And if you enjoy it, make sure you hit the like button and make sure you subscribe on YouTube. And if you're listening to this anywhere else, make sure you go to the YouTube channel, subscribe, check out some other stuff I have on there. So, I'm glad to have you here. I appreciate you. Thank you for joining me on the Storytime Saturday podcast. I'll see you next week.